The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Thank you, Tally Olson. We are back. Vintage Sports in the Zone. I'm Ralph Tycho with the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and I have the privilege of assembling the four mavens of the time. Alan Blumpkin, who's yet to join us. George Case.
Good evening, everybody.
All right. And David Hubler is here.
Good evening.
Good evening, David. And now for our leader for the evening, Mr. Hal Bock. Hal Bock, how you doing?
Hi, everybody. I wanted to discuss tonight the news of the day. Really, the news of the off season in baseball was the action taken yesterday by Commissioner Rob Manfred in the scoundrel-laden Houston Astros organization. Manfred finally took action over the signal stealing debacle, in which he suspended the manager of the Astros, A.J. Hinch, and the general manager of the Astros, Jeff Lunau, for their non-actions in this sign-stealing debacle that they were involved in. And within an hour or so after the commissioner suspended those two guys, the owner of the team fired them. So the Astros face a very touchy situation. They're a month away from spring training, and right now they don't have a manager and they don't have a general manager. What I'm curious about from the panel is whether you thought that the commissioner's action was appropriate, or could he have taken more action, less action? Don't forget, he took away the first and second round draft choices for the next 2 years from the Astros. That is a very major part of this penalty, because the draft is where you get your young talent, and they will be missing 4 rounds, 4 players who would have been important to their future. The commissioner also fined them $5 million. That's nothing. That's a middle reliever, and $5 million is chump change in the economy today, in baseball economy today. So what I'm curious about is whether this panel thinks that this action was enough, not enough, or too much. I'll leave it over to you guys now. Go ahead.
George, you're closest to baseball. What do you think?
Well, yeah, you know what? I think personally. I mean, I'm sort of ambivalent. I mean, I realize Major League Baseball had to do something, and I think Manfred, was correct in his actions. Something had to be done because sign stealing has been part of baseball for a long time, but the Major League Baseball rules specifically, from what I've read, and I haven't read up on all this stuff, specifically say it's against the rules to electronically steal signs. So if that's the case, then I think Manfred did act responsibly, and he did suspend him, as Hal mentioned, and then the ownership of the Astros then fired. From what I understand, fired both the manager and general manager. So as Hal has also brought out, I mean, that creates a huge problem going into spring training, with spring training less than 30 days away, and now you don't have anybody at the top. So I think, Manfred was trying to quell this as best he could and say, hey, guys, no more. We're not doing this again. We're not going to go through this again. If we do, the penalties will be even worse because Major League Baseball has enough problems. They can't be in a situation where everybody is looking at each other and say, okay, how are we stealing the signs this year? We're going to be banging drums, electronic signals, spy gates, drones. Who the hell knows where they're going to end? But I think the action, my opinion, was appropriate to nip it in the bud as much as they can. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. What I'm curious about, by the way, the one key factor in this whole scandal and the evolving situation in Boston is Alex Cora, who was the bench coach with the Astros when this happened. He has been subsequently just tonight, in fact, he's been let go by the Red Sox for whatever. Well, we know the reasoning, obviously. It's because of his part in the scandal with the Astros, but he may have been also involved in this as a principal in this ongoing situation with the Red Sox. My feeling is, if that's the case, and they find evidence that Cora was involved in the sign stealing in both clubs, I think he should be banned for life. I mean, that to me is as big a scandal as taking enhancing drugs. You can't have a guy going from one team to another, and his portfolio includes how to steal signs electronically. So he's got to go.
The interesting thing here, there's a couple of aspects to this. First of all, the interesting thing is the Astros, when he was the bench coach in 17 and stealing signs, won the World Series. The Red Sox, when he was the manager in 18 and stealing signs, won the World Series.
Right.
So you would have to say that's not a coincidence. That's the common denominator is Alex Cora. Now, he's apparently been fired by the Red Sox tonight, and you knew that was coming. That was a no-brainer. What I'm curious about, and I want to ask you guys your opinion. Pete Rose was suspended for life for betting on baseball games. He didn't try to fix games. He didn't try to steal games, steal signals, or affect the outcome of games. He just bet on games. I think this team is going to win and that team's going to lose. Now, do you think him being suspended for life, these two guys were suspended for just 1 year? I'm wondering if what they did really was worse than what Pete Rose did. Pete Rose
I agree. Hal, that's a great question, because when you put it down on paper and you start thinking of the pluses and the minuses, what Pete Rose did, and according to what I've read, he didn't even bet on his own team. He just bet on other games in the league. That's far less worthy of such a lifetime ban as what's going on immediately. Because what we see here now is actual, screwing with the game on the field, and that can't be allowed to happen.
We're talking about the integrity of the game.
Exactly.
You're messing with the integrity of the game.
That's right.
And you know what I think, and again, this is an old man talking here, but what I think, this happens when you invite outsiders into the game, into positions of importance, rather than baseball men. These guys, particularly the general manager, Lunau was an engineer, and he was a management consultant. He's not a baseball guy. So he doesn't have the respect for the game that baseball people have, and that's in my opinion. And I just think that longtime baseball lifers, the guys you call baseball lifers, would never dream in 1,000 years of pulling a stunt like this. And for him to deny knowing anything about it, that's ridiculous. The general manager knows what's going on in his clubhouse, on the field, in the front office. He's the major domo. He's the chief executive officer of this operation. So for him to deny knowing anything about it or knowing you were breaking rules, it's ridiculous. The manager did the same thing. The manager knew that they were banging garbage cans, and didn't he wonder what that was all about? Didn't he ask anybody, why are you banging the garbage cans? I mean,
you know what, Hal, I happen to agree with you 100%. They had to know. That's part of it. They had to know. And I also agree with you 100%. If they were baseball guys at the top, the way general managers used to be, that they wouldn't have done that kind of stuff. I said it before, sign stealing was part of the game, but it was observing and learning consistencies and learning situations. You're going to look for a certain sign, and you're going to be able to say, hey, look, here, you're sitting on the bench and you're saying to a guy, you're saying, hey, I just picked up a sign. There's guys that are huge sign stealing experts, but they do it, by observing. They don't do it electronically. And so Hal, I agree with you. I think it's all some of the outside influences coming in, trying to cheat and steal and do whatever you can, business wise, and get away with it. And now, you've got a sport that the integrity, and I'm with you 100% on that too. The integrity of the sport is being challenged by this kind of situation.
Well, a footnote on what Hal was saying with Lou now. According to this front page article in the Washington Post, which is a pretty impressive piece to place it, Lunau was instrumental in getting rid of many of their minor league coaches and scouts, and they used just statistics. They went along with video analysis instead of
all analytics. It's all analytics.
This whole analytics thing, right?
And that's because he was not a baseball man.
Right.
That's right.
Remember that movie with Clint Eastwood where he was an old baseball guy, and there was something called The Left-Hander. I forget the name of the movie.
Yeah, it was Trouble with the Curve, wasn't it?
Trouble with the Curve. Thank you.
Right.
Yes. And he was an old baseball man, and this guy is not, never has been. That's what hurt the Yankees in the 70s when they were owned by CBS. I mean, you got to be in the game. That's the bottom line, and you have to respect the game.
There were players who were so expert at stealing signs that they earned a place on the roster, even though they were marginal players. They'd earn a place on the roster. Just sit on the bench and study what was going on, looking for tendencies. It's true, And
yeah.
To me, that's part of the charm of the game. And to have cameras and video replays and stuff like that to decode the signs, that's terrible. We're moving in the direction of robotics here, and we're going to have robot umpires before too very long. And this game is supposed to be played by human beings and managed by human beings. And the whole idea of the game being turned over to these Ivy League intellectuals, to me, is just wrong. It's just wrong. It's not the game I grew up with.
Well, I was trying to explain this to my wife this evening while we were having dinner, and she knew a good deal about what had happened because she'd read the Post. And she said the irony of it is that they were using all this technology, and then at the end of this thing, they were just simply banging on a garbage pail.
That's right. and also, didn't anybody notice that they were banging on a drum and
right?
saying,
yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, I think didn't that all came about when somebody had a video, not a video, but you could hear the audio in the background. You could hear this clanging or whatever the hell it was. So.
Yes, you're right. And apparently there was a point where a White Sox pitcher named Danny Farquhar, and he had a terrible episode. He had a brain aneurysm, nearly died in the dugout. But he picked it up. He noticed that the drums were banging, and he mentioned it or talked about it, and the Astros heard that he was on to them, and they were terrified that he was going to blow the whistle on them. But he wasn't sure what was going on. He just knew that every so often the trash can got banged,
Yeah, according to the story I read, he sort of signaled, like he was pointing to his ear, to his dugout. Hey, listen, what is this that we're hearing?
Well, it's
and where was that? Wasn't that in the tunnel or something? They had a table set up, and the guy would get the signal from the scoreboard or whatever it is through his headpiece, and then he would sit there and bang on the garbage can in the tunnel so they would all hear it. Is that basically?
In modern baseball, which is not necessarily my favorite thing, they all have video replay rooms because umpires have to be able to look at replays. Right. So they have a room set up with video equipment, and what they were doing was had a camera in center field relaying the catcher's signs to these video machines. And they would have somebody in that room, a player or one of the coaches or whoever, and he would decode what the video machine was showing and bang the drum. One bang for a curveball, two bangs for a fastball, or whatever the code was. I don't know. But here's another question for you, and this was brought up to me by my son the attorney. said to me tonight, well, why aren't the players being penalized? They were the ones who were doing it. And to some extent, that's a good question. The players were deeply involved. I mean, who was carrying this whole thing out? The uniformed players. So should they have been penalized? And if they should have been, how do you penalize them? There's a 25-man roster, and many of the players are on different teams now. How do you deal with that? Well, don't you? Manfred chose not to. But you could make an argument for penalizing the players. Maybe take away their World Series rings. You can't take away the championship. It's not done. Although in the NCAA they do that. They take away.
Right.
Basketball
I can't see them, taking away the rings. But one interesting statistic about this whole thing was that during the 2017 postseason, the Astros went 8-1 at home, and on the road they were 3-6.
Sure,
because all the cheating was being done at home.
I mean, it's just so obvious,
Yes.
I mean, it's no mystery, and yet they got away with it for a while.
Well, you raise a good question. Your son raised a good question about that, about the players. Surely there must have been one or two ringleaders besides, and I'm allegedly Cora too, who really must have. Well,
apparently the only player who was mentioned in Manfred's report today or yesterday was the new manager of the Mets, Carlos Beltran. Apparently Beltran is the one who dreamt it up.
Oh, wow.
He said that we have to figure out a way to decode the signals, a better way to decode the signals. And he dreamt up the scheme. Now, he was a player at the time. He's now the manager of the Mets. What do? Do you suspend Carlos Beltran? They didn't. They said he will not be penalized, will not be punished. But, that becomes a question, too.
Well, I think
he was at the heart of the whole thing.
Yeah. One of the outcomes has got to be like an asterisk, after the World Series champions 2017, because as you say, you can't take the championship away from them, and I doubt whether you could really get their rings back either. It just probably is too impractical. But certainly something has to be in the record book.
I think that's what Manfred decided, that it was too much of a hassle to punish the 25 players on the roster. Some of them on other teams. The guy who blew the whistle is now with the Oakland A's, Mike Fears. The pitcher said, this went on. So that would be a very complicated problem for baseball.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I don't know. It seems to me that those 25 guys, bear some responsibility in this whole thing. They were the ones who were carrying it out.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you about that. I mean, a player, if he's going to be given an advantage, knowing human nature, he's going to take that advantage. And that obviously was something that the players, I'm sure, when they have clubhouse meetings and they go over signals and signs and all that kind of stuff. So, at some point, they went over this scheme and said, here's what we come up with. And I'm sure some of the players are sitting there and said, man, it's going to mean a couple more points on my batting average, so more money.
Sure.
Or whatever.
Sure.
But, that's the nature of the beast. But I personally think that this is only the tip. I've said this about other scandals, the tip of the iceberg. But I think Manfred is trying to stop it before it gets any further, because some other teams are going to come up with other schemes that are more sophisticated. And who knows? I mean, the technology that we're going through today with drones and all this kind of electronic stuff that goes on, it's scary. And, I'm with you guys about baseball. I mean, to me, being around the game all my life, I loved it as a baseball person. But this is a totally new world as far as I'm concerned.
One of the weakest excuses I've seen, according to the statement, was that some of the Astro players said that if Hinch had told them to stop engaging in this conduct, they would have immediately stopped. Now, what kind of
right? Hey, David,
are these kids?
David, I got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. You want to buy it?
Exactly. Yeah. They were just so browbeaten by Hinch that they had to go along with whatever he said. And of course, he didn't say stop it.
Right.
Well, the story I read said that Hinch destroyed the video recorder twice during the season because he was so annoyed with the whole idea. But he didn't tell them not to do it,
Right.
Yeah, he didn't write it out in pen and paper. You must not do this.
I like the quote that I read in the paper today. Phil Hughes, the old pitcher, pitched for the Yankees for a while.
Yeah.
Like a relief pitcher, short and ineffective. But he said, I'd like my career numbers against Altuve, Springer, and Correa erased from the record books. Seriously, though, it's bad. Can they do that? Because apparently those guys lit him up pretty good.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good question, though. How far back did this go? Was it just in the playoffs? Or how did it affect batting averages of opposing players?
It's a whole barrel of worms.
It sure is.
You're opening up here, a can of worms that you're opening up here.
No,
because
in this case, I think it's a barrel.
Right. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as PEDs. Because how many of Alex Rodriguez's 600-odd home runs were hit thanks to performance-enhancing drugs? I would think a lot. I don't know how many, but you just throw off all. And baseball is of all the sports, I believe, baseball is the one most dependent on statistics, past performance, and that sort of thing. And this throws the whole thing out of the window. If I know what pitch is coming, that might give me an advantage. Some of the players don't like to know what pitch is coming. The agent for Altuve, who's one terrific ball player, said that he hates the idea of knowing what pitch is coming because it throws off his timing. Is that true? I don't know. But
well, you know what? I can only tell you from playing that, some players don't want to know. Other players do want to know. It really depends. It's how you adjust yourself, you adjust your swing, where you stand in the batter's box, all that kind of stuff.
Sure,
of course, there's also the other part of it. If you know that a guy is anticipating and somebody knows you're stealing a signal, well, then all of a sudden they're going to switch signals. And they do that a lot of times, especially if there's a runner on second base. And at team meetings, they'll go over that and they'll say, okay, here's what our signs are with nobody on. Here's what our signs are with a runner on second or first or whatever the situation is. So you try to prevent sign stealing for that very reason. A guy on second base can look directly into the catcher. And sometimes, the catchers are playing games anyhow. They're flipping their fingers down and doing all kinds of stuff. That might not even be the sign. The sign might be coming from the dugout. Or the sign might be coming from how, he touches his chest protector or he does something that they come up with a way to defeat the fact that the runner on second base is looking in to pick up the sign and that he in turn then would give the sign to the hitter in some form.
Well, you got to do that. That's a defense mechanism against sign stealers. And,
exactly.
There's an old saying in baseball, if you ain't cheating, you ain't trying. Well, that's gone on in baseball for 100 years, more than 100 years.
Yes, it has.
It's part of the gamesmanship of the game.
Right.
And I'm sure in your dad's time, George, that there were sign stealers and there were craftsmen, people who could
absolutely.
make a living stealing
I can
signs.
tell you, Hal, you're absolutely right. I mean, I can remember my dad, and I can remember even as a kid, my father telling me about signs. He said, now look, he said, they're going to give an indicator. An indicator sign is going to be given by the third base coach, and it's going to be the signal after the indicator. That'll give what the batter is going to get the sign. And sometimes you'll see, and if you'll see at times in Major League Baseball, watching on television or going to a ball game, the batter will call a timeout, and he'll want to have a conference with the third base coach to make sure that he picked up the sign. That's part of the game. That's what they do.
Some of them can be so complicated, and some of the players I've talked to over the years are not exactly Rhodes Scholars, that it would be an issue for them to know which sign is the on sign, which sign is the indicator. And, you know, it's not. It's a simple thing, and it's not a simple thing. There's a book out that you guys should know about, written by a good friend of mine, Paul Dixon.
Yes.
The Hidden Language of Baseball.
Right.
And it's all about signs and sign stealing and so forth. He's an expert in that
He's
field.
great. He's great. He got a write-up today in the New York Times, I understand, for the book.
I believe he did, yeah. I believe he did.
Yeah, I think I have one of Paul's books, too. How you mentioned him, and David, I think he wrote a book on how to keep score.
Yes, he did.
Very similar, you know, trying to give you the inside look at baseball with sign stealing, but also the inside look at baseball keeping score, because a lot of people, I mean, they love to keep score, but they keep it in different ways. But Paul's book was about, you know, the accepted way of keeping score that, you know, sports writers use or whatever, so you can pick up, you know, what went on during the game. Of course, today it's a little bit different. I mean, as we've talked about before, you know, people, instead of keeping score, they're talking on their cell phones and looking around and eating gourmet food rather than watching what's happening on the field.
Yeah, that's another annoyance that I find. You know.
And listen to all the crazy music coming out of the loudspeakers.
Oh God, yeah. Well,
we're way
off. Yeah, we're way off the topic when we get to that, but we'll hold on to that for spring training.
That's another issue. You're right, David.
No, I mean, but just the last word. Paul Dixon has written so many great books about biographies of sports figures, and also just these great compilations of stats and figures and oddities. He's a walking encyclopedia.
He did a biography of Leo DeRocher that's really good. And Leo was one of the people who got himself suspended for a year because he was hanging out with unsavory characters. That was in 1947.
Yeah, he quoted me. He quoted me in the book about DeRocher, because we were talking about it one day, and I said, I used to go to the Polo Grounds to see the Giants play quite often when DeRocher was managing. And he would manage from third base, and the first thing he would do with his spikes, he would erase the chalk line around the third base coach's box. And Paul didn't know that. He said, "Are you sure that's true?" I said, "Yeah, I saw it so many times."
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's good.
That's great. He put that in the book.
Yeah, he's a terrific
writer. You know what, as far as I'm concerned, I got another question to ask you guys, but, you know, with all this that's going on now, do you think that this opens the door to the underworld for getting involved in this kind of stuff?
That's tough to say.
I'm just curious. I mean, as you mentioned about DeRocher and gamblers and all that kind of stuff, Hal, you know, because to me, you know, there are certain people in this country that are looking to profit big time, and maybe they can get their hands into this mess, and hopefully it's going to be stopped. But if it gets even worse, you know, they start to really taint the game.
Well,
then.
You know, first of all, George, let's talk about the 1919 Black Sox, who 8 men out, eight players were suspended by Judge Landis for conspiring to fix the World Series.
Right.
And the record is the World Series was fixed. Now, the problem in that era is that the players were not getting any money from the ownership. There's a famous story about Ed Seacott, the best pitcher on the staff, and he had a deal where if he won 30 games, he would get a $10,000 bonus. And he won 29 games that season, and the ownership, Chuck Comiskey, ordered him not to be pitched in the last month of the season, or last couple of weeks of the season. If you don't pitch him, he can't win that 30th game. If he doesn't win the 30th game, he doesn't get the $10,000 payoff. Well, things like that went on throughout baseball, and as a result, there was a lot of funny business going on in baseball in that period of time, in the dead ball era, that would really be an embarrassment to the game. Now, today, the minimum salary is $550,000, which is not a bad living for a ball player. And so the temptation isn't there to fix games. The gamblers would have to figure out some real scheme to fix games in this day and age. I think that's
Well, that could be, Hal. I mean, I'm just throwing it out because I'm watching television, watching some of the football games over the weekend, and you see all these gambling sites and all this kind of stuff that they're advertising and really looking to make some money. And I'm just thinking if at some point baseball starts to get tainted and somebody says, hey, we can make a lot of bucks, let's figure out a way to change the outcome of these games. And, I hope it doesn't reach that point, but it certainly could.
Well, George, tell the story about your dad when the caller in Detroit.
With Dutch Leonard? Yeah.
With Dutch Leonard,
Yeah, that was the story. I mean, it nothing ever came of it, but Dutch Leonard and my dad were roommates, and in the 40, I think it was the 45 season, and all of a sudden, the phone rings, and here it was a gambler, and he called Dutch and on the phone and said, hey, you know what? If you don't have a pretty good game next outing, it might mean some money in your pocket. And Dutch told my father, and my father said, Dutch, you got to go to Ozzie Bluegee, the manager. You got to let him know. You got to let him know that, which Dutch did, and nothing ever came of it. But that was, David, what you're saying. I mean, that was absolutely true because my dad told me about it.
Yes, and that was a critical game at the very end of the 44 season.
45, right.
45 season, which meant either they could win the pennant or lose the pennant.
Right. Right.
If Dutch Leonard had thrown the game. And
yeah, I mean, and that's how innocent it was at that point. I mean, my God, This is 50, 60, 70, whatever years ago. But I mean, here's a phone call to their hotel room, and it just so happened that when Dutch is on the phone and tells my dad what the conversation was. So, I mean, if it had been a phone call from a payphone in a remote area of someplace, who knows what would have happened? But that was the way it was done back then. And thankfully, and my dad said to me, he said, I'm so happy that Dutch told me, and he said, I thought I gave him the right advice, and Dutch went to Bluegee, and Bluegee thanked him and said, hey, Dutch, don't even give it another thought about it. You go out and do what you have to do to win the game. And that was
the end. He did, too. He pitched a good game.
Right.
He won.
The irony of George mentioning Dutch Leonard, I'm reading a book right now about a fixed game that very few people know about, and it involved Tris Speaker and Ty Cobb. And the Dutch Leonard blew the whistle because he had a letter from each of those players in the postseason talking about how they had arranged the outcome of this game. It was a meaningless end-of-the-season game, but nevertheless, it was a fix. And these two players were player managers, Cobb with, I think, Detroit, and Tris Speaker with, I think, Cleveland. And they both, the following season, were no longer in baseball. They were no longer player managers. They were no longer players. And it was not known, widely known at least, what that was all about. But Leonard blew the whistle. Leonard was unhappy about being cut from one team or another. And he went to the commissioner's office and the league president's office. Van Johnson was the league president, and he was in a feud with Judge Landis. So nothing much came of it, but there was a fixed game, and it involved two of the greatest stars in the history of basebol. And
now, was that the same Dutch?
You're very right about that. And I just want to mention one other thing. I'm going to let David. People have said to me, well, Dutch Leonard and the scandal you're talking about with Cobb and Speaker, but they were two different Dutch Leonards.
Right, that's right.
And I tell people, I say, you're talking about the Dutch Leonard who was a left-handed major league pitcher. I'm talking about the Dutch Leonard who was a right-handed knuckleball pitcher for Washington.
Oh, my God. You're right. Of course you're right.
That's right.
I just had to throw that in because it's been thrown up to me so many times. That's all.
Oh, that's hilarious. Thank you. Thank you for pointing that out.
That's what I was trying to get in. I said, that Dutch Leonard would have been pretty old if it was the same Dutch Leonard, and then he fought in World War II.
There's something unfair about that, using the same name.
Yeah, I think anybody named Leonard now is given a nickname Dutch for some reason.
Yeah, I bet you're right.
Yeah. Well, it's funny
it's
because
good to have some levity on an evening when the conversation is not very very pleasant regarding baseball. I'll tell you, it's a sad day really for baseball, and you don't know how this is going to all work out. I mean, two managers have now lost their jobs, and it's very unlikely that they'll ever get jobs again in the game.
Right.
And the same thing goes for the front office guy, Luno. Who's going to hire him? Nobody. So, it's a really sad day in baseball because it reflects poorly on the Astros and on the World Series and on the Red Sox as well. And they've got to clean it up. Now, how they're going to clean it up, I don't know. But that's another topic for another day.
Well, it is, Hal, and I really appreciate you bringing that up for a topic for tonight because it was very much a part of what David and myself and we were going to talk about tonight. And all of a sudden, all these breaking stories, I mean, the last couple of days, it's been amazing. And I'm with you. I hope the integrity of the game is retained. What the outcome is, all Manfred is going to do, I really don't know. But I think he had to try to stop it. Whether this is going to stop it, I hope it does. But, when guys start losing their jobs, that's a pretty big incentive saying, hey, just don't do this anymore. It's a hell of a lot more than just a slap on the hand or a slap on the wrist.
True.
Yep.
Anyway, another topic for another day.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks very much for joining in tonight.
Take care, guys.
Yep. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
Yep.
Good night.
Good night. Good night, Hal. Good night, David.
Good night, George. Bye, Hal. Bye.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.